5-6, Day 2, Graphs of Other Trig Functions. In this lesson now we're going to look at the secant curve, which uses the cosine curve. So if you look at my unit circle, cosine represents the x-coordinates. And so at 0, let me do this. X is theta. Your y values are secant of theta. So at 0, cosine is 1, so if you do the reciprocal, it's still 1. At pi over 2, cosine is 0, and if you do the reciprocal, it's undefined. At pi, cosine is -1, and if you do the reciprocal, it's still -1. At 3 pi over 2, cosine is 0, and if you do the reciprocal, it's undefined. And at 2 pi, cosine is 1. If you do the reciprocal, it's still 1. So when I do my cosine curve, remember it shapes like that bell shape. And then when you graph secant, it'll have a relative minimum, a relative maximum, and a relative minimum. Now you can draw the curve full out or you can just leave it. And then here again, your amplitude for cosine, absolute value of A, 2 pi over B. Your phase shift, remember if it's plus, you're moving left C units. If it's minus, you're moving right. Your midline is y equals d. And for your key points, you always start at your phase shift, and then you do 1/4 times your period to know what to add each time. So looking at example 1, we're going to look at the secant graph, which really we're using the cosine graph. And I'm going to factor out a 2 so I can get x by itself. So when you do pi over 2 divided by 2, that's the same thing as pi over 2 times 1/2, which is how I got pi over 4. So your amplitude for your cosine graph is the absolute value of 1, which is 1. Your period is 2 pi over b, which is pi. Your phase shift, we're moving right, pi over 4. Your midline is y equals 2. So your first key point is pi over 4. And then you're going to take your period, or 1/4 times your period, which means we're adding pi over 4 each time. I like to have everything set up. So pi over 4 plus 5 pi over 4 is 2 pi over 4. 2 pi over 4 plus pi over 4 is 3 pi over 4. 3 pi over 4 plus pi over 4 is 4 pi over 4. And 4 pi over 4 plus pi over 4 is 5 pi over 4. Okay, so let's look at this graph. Remember, we have a midline. So this is your new 0. And since your amplitude is 1, we're only going up 1 and down 1 from your midline. And then your x coordinates are pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, 4 pi over 4, and 5 pi over 4. Okay, so the cosine graph, remember, starts at your max, then we have an asymptote, then your min, Then we have an asymptote. And back at your max. So your cosine graph would be similar to this curve, but we want secant. So remember, you're going to have a relative minimum, a relative maximum, and a relative minimum. Let's look at what happens when A is negative for the secant graph. Remember, we're really graphing cosine. So I'm going to do the absolute value of A, which is 3/2. Your period is 2 pi over B, which is 2. Oh, I didn't write this so you can see. Your phase shift is none. Midline is y equals 0. So you're going to do 1/4 times your period, which is 2/4, which is 1/2. So you're going to start your first x at 0, and then you're going to keep adding 1/2 each time. So 0 plus 1/2 is 1/2. 1/2 plus 1/2 is 2/2. 2/2 plus 1/2 is 3/2. 3/2 plus 1/2 is 4/2. So your midline is at 0. And your amplitude is 3/2, which is your max, and -3/2, which is your min. So our x values are 0, 1/2, 2/2, 3/2, and 4/2. Okay, so for the cosine graph, we would start at your max. Then we have an asymptote, your min. Then we have an asymptote, and back at your max. So this is the cosine curve, but we want secant. So we have well, guess what we forgot? A was negative. Be careful. All right, let's try this again. So we have your min, asymptote, max, asymptote, and back at your min. So this is your cosine curve. And so when you do secant, you're going to have a relative maximum, a relative minimum, and a relative maximum.